looks at a biblical, or attempts at a look at a biblical view of child raising. And tonight, under the heading of Defining the Universe, I want to take one more kick at the can and give one last look at the subject and get quite specific, actually, as we're through the general principles and now looking at some of the fine-tuning elements. Not that we've covered all the big topics, but as many as we're going to look at. I want to start tonight by reminding you of some of the things we've looked at, and this provides a summary of what I've been saying all along, and I can summarize all that I've said to you over these 7 weeks by this sentence: the essence of child raising is training in obedience. Is that angle unreadable over there? No, you can see that, eh? The essence of child raising is discipline, but the definition in the Bible of discipline is training in obedience. We looked at the beginning in the Proverbs where it says, raise up a child. No, where it says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. It's the rod of discipline that will remove it far from him. The rod being an element in the whole discipline process, not the sum and substance of discipline, but part of it. Discipline is training in obedience, and we ought to understand that very clearly. And there are many reasons why the essence of child raising is training in obedience. Is the tape in trouble? No, okay. Many reasons why we need to teach our children to obey. And let me remind you that that's not belligerent obedience. That doesn't count as obedience if it's belligerent or sulky or defiant obedience. It's a contradiction in terms. We're talking about cheerful obedience, glad obedience. And your responsibility, your most important responsibility as a parent, aside from simply protecting and providing for them, is to teach them to gladly obey you. And we can make some general statements about all this and say that if you don't train your children to obey, they will get hurt one way or the other. Quite likely they will hurt themselves, either physically or morally or spiritually. You must protect them from the self-destructive roots that are founded in their own hearts. They will get hurt in the world, or they will hurt themselves if they don't learn to obey. Take a simple example. If you don't teach your children to obey you when it comes to traffic rules, then they might get hit by a car. And if you don't train them to obey you on moral issues of a more subtle nature, they will sin against God. And if you don't teach them to obey you in regard to health practices and so on, they could make themselves sick. They will get hurt. But then besides that, if you don't train your children to obey, I hope you see it now, they will be miserable, because joy comes from obedience. And the happy child is the child who has learned to obey, and to find obedience a rewarding experience. It won't work. They will not be happy if there's no rewards in obedience. But a child, like a puppy, has something within him that's at war with that foolishness, a willingness to be pleasing to his master or to his parent, to her parent. And you can make your children very, very joyful, very, very happy people if you will train them to obey. And that will be their source of joy as it becomes our source of joy in the spiritual realm. And I think you can see that in the families, perhaps not in your own family, you can see it in the families of other people. Obedient children are generally happy children, and uncooperative, disobedient children tend to be kind of miserable. And then besides that, if you don't train them to obey, you will be miserable, because belligerent and disobedient children are no fun to have around, and they're no fun to be around, and your house will be a miserable place if your children are miserable, and you will be miserable if they make it a miserable place. So then child raising becomes a much, much more onerous task, a much less joyful task than it ought to be. And you probably have feelings about that in regard to some parent friends of yours, and you see the frustration that they are going through trying to get their kids under control, trying to get their kids just to do something, follow a simple instruction, and they look at you and they say, oh, it's so tough to be a parent. And you say, well, under these circumstances, it certainly is. But it doesn't need to be that complicated or tough. If the children had learned somewhere along the line, or were learning to say, yes, Mom, yes, Dad, and go do it without hardly thinking about it, then child raising would not be all that difficult. So your misery level has a lot to do with your success in training your children to obey. And then on the most important level of all, if you don't train your children to obey, then how will they learn to obey God? Teaching them to obey, parents, is the foundation by which they learn to obey God. This very thought is appealed to in Hebrews. We'll get to chapter 12 in a few weeks to come, Lord willing. And there the writer to the Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12 It's for discipline that you endure. That is, the difficulties you go through in life are for the sake of God disciplining you. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? What son is there whom his father does not train to obey? The writer is implying that it's absolutely absurd to think of a father who does not train his children to obey. What son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. The author is saying, I can't conceive of a situation in which a parent would not be actively involved in teaching his child to obey, would not be disciplining him in obedience. Must be an illegitimate child. Must be a severed connection between the parent and the child if the parent is not actively teaching the child to obey. He goes on, furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? Lots of circumstances in which we do not. People do not respect their fathers or do not have earthly fathers, but this is the general principle. And you see how the writer works. He says, what motivation is there to obey God? Well, think about it. You obeyed. Pretty graceful, pretty graceful. What motivation is there to obey God? Well, you obeyed your fathers, didn't you? And you respected them, didn't you? Well, then how much more should be subject to the Father of your spirit? And I hope you see the point that learning to obey parents is the groundwork, is the training ground in which the children are being set up to obey God. Remember what Sarah Edwards said in that quotation that I brought to you a few weeks ago. What was said about Sarah Edwards, her system of discipline was begun at a very early age, and it was her role to resist the first as well as every subsequent exhibition of temper or disobedience in the child, however young, until its will was brought into submission to the will of its parents, wisely reflecting that until a child will obey his parents, he can never be brought to obey God. Well, if there wasn't any other reason for teaching your child to gladly obey you, and there are many reasons, but if there weren't any other reason to teach your child to gladly obey you, that would be the reason. How can you expect your child to ever learn to obey God if he or she has actually been trained against obeying you? So we have this summary statement of all that we've looked at. The essence of biblical child raising is training your child to obey, and you're succeeding if your child is happy to obey. And you should be able to get your child to enthusiastically accept the fact that this is the way the world is. Doesn't have to understand it, just has to accept the fact that this is the way the world is. The children obey the parents. Like the Family Circus cartoon, again, where Jeffy says to his friend on the way to school, I got a new system for getting along with my mother. She tells me what to do, and I do it. He's discovered that this is the best way it works. And I remember my own child when Debbie was working on her attitude, when Jessica was 3 or 4, and Deb was working on her attitude of enthusiastic obedience. She was saying yes or okay or not saying anything when she obeyed. And Debbie said to her, I don't want you to just say okay. I want you to say yes, let's. So then the next day I said to Jessica, we should go and do something. And she said, Ness, let's. I said, pardon? She said, Mom likes me to say Ness, let's. It had no meaning to her, but she was willing to accept the terms. When you obey, you always say Ness, let's. And she's, waited to find out the next nonsense phrase that she was expected to repeat. Don't have to understand it at that point. Just have to get set up to say, here's what we do because this is the way things are. And how do you teach your child to obey? Again, to summarize, well, you've got to do everything you can to encourage their obedience. Make obedience a very fulfilling experience for them. So you've got to enthusiastically cheer them on. And you've got to brag to them about them. And you brag to your spouse about them in their hearing so that they catch on to the fact that you are sincerely enthusiastic about their obedience. So you let your child hear you saying to your spouse, or if not a spouse, then perhaps to your own parent or someone in the house, because I think it's probably a little indecent to be bragging to your neighbors about your kids. But you want to let your kids hear you saying, you should see how happily she obeys. You've got to make it a delicious experience for your child. And at the same time, consistently and lovingly discouraging disobedience. Remember from Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, you have your grief and your joy to motivate them. And a wise son makes his father glad, but a foolish son is a grief to his mother. You need to steer your child towards obedience by leading them on with your gladness and pushing them along with your grief. And if you teach them to obey, then your hope is that they will learn to obey God. And of course they will obey God for the same reason they obey you, because they love God as they love you. And they will not only love God and therefore obey God, but they will love to obey God. That's part of the relationship that Jesus offers us. It will be their great joy. It says that in John chapter 15. It will be their great joy that they keep His commandments. It's up to the Lord to make it joyful as they obey Him. It's up to you to make it a joyful experience for them to obey you. And if they love to obey God, then they will love to serve God. And tonight I would like to give you some ideas on what you must do in your child's life, what you should try to do in order to prepare them to not only love God and love to obey God, but to serve God. And our text will be Psalm 127, verses 4 and 5. Let's turn there together. Psalm 127, verses 4 and 5. Psalm 127 is a psalm well known for its reference to children. It says in verse 3, children are a gift of the Lord, or a heritage of the Lord, an inheritance of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward, and that's well known. That's a wall plaque verse, but I draw your attention to the verses below that. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Get that? Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. Let me ask you some questions about this analogy and then try to provide you with the answers. How are children, the children of one's youth, like arrows in the hand of a warrior? What's the sense of the analogy? How are children like arrows? I think the answer is this, that arrows, think about it, arrows are weapons that a warrior uses to destroy his enemies. Arrows are tools or weapons that a warrior uses to win his battles and to bring his wars to an end. So how are children like arrows? Well, children are like arrows when raised biblically to obey God, to love to obey God, to love to serve God. Children, in growing up and leaving you, are like arrows when they, leaving you, go to do battle in the world against your enemies. Children are like arrows if in your hand they are prepared to go from your house, go from their child-raising years into the battles that you are fighting to fight against your enemies. Well, that may sound a little overly military to some people or a little hawkish, but I need to remind you that as a Christian, and we're only thinking biblically here, we're only thinking about people who are concerned with making things consistent biblically or their lives consistent with the Bible. Every Bible-believing person is in a war. We do not war against flesh and blood, but we war against spiritual principalities and powers in heavenly places. We are at war, and we are either winning the battles involved in the war or we are losing the battles. We're certainly in a war as Satan fights against the people of Christ. And our children will take up their place in that battle, at least because they are children of warriors. If we are Christians, we are in the battle for good or for bad, for success or for defeat. Our children will either be simply descendants of soldiers, or they themselves will be soldiers in the war. But they will suffer casualty, they'll suffer loss in the war, or they will succeed in the war, depending on how well they are prepared to take up their place in the battle. Children are like arrows if they succeed in advancing the cause and doing battle against those enemies who are our enemies. Let's think further. Why are they said to be in our hands? Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Well, finally, the children are in our hands, or our children are ours like arrows in the hand when they are ready to go. The warrior has a fistful of arrows. He's about to take them into battle with them, or he's about to put one on the string and shoot it. The children are like arrows in the warrior's hands when they are ready to go, when they are they're ready to be shot, they're ready to have their impact upon the world. But before they ever got to battle, before the warrior ever got his arrows to battle, the arrows were in his hand as he was shaping them and taking them from what they first were to make them what they were to become as arrows. Once they are arrows, they are straight and sharp pieces of wood. But before they ever were straight and sharp, they were just sticks. They were crooked and they were dull. As children come to us, they are not the least bit prepared to have any good impact against our enemies. They're not the least bit able to take up a place on the front. But if they are properly shaped and tempered by the child-raising years, they will become increasingly straight and sharp. That is, they'll become increasingly able to fight the battles that they will certainly encounter as they go. So they're in our hands in order to be turned into arrows. They're in our hands in order to become battle-ready. And then finally, they're in our hands because they are battle-ready. They're ready to be shot. They're ready to go out and defeat our enemies. They're ready to go out and win the battles that God has called us to. And so then to decode or to try to put some practical terms to this military imagery, it's not a literal battle. It's not a physical battle. We don't war against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers. We should ask, what are they to do in order to fulfill their function? I mean, in what sense do we shoot them? In what sense are they like arrows speeding into the hearts of our enemies to put them to death? Well, it says in verse 5, they shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. And this is decoding the analogy. Arrows don't speak, right? So he's no longer talking about arrows, he's talking about your children. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. How blessed is the man who, like a warrior with arrows in his quiver, has some children. Those children shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. This whole idea of speaking with enemies in the gate is a reference to the fact that the gate was the public square. The gate was the place where people talked, where encounters were had with people of all sorts of backgrounds. And there's a previous biblical reference and a later biblical reference that you ought to bear in mind as we think about our children speaking to their enemies in the gate. Let me put it up there. Genesis chapter 22, the covenant promise to Abraham. Genesis chapter 22, I'll read this to you. And look for the reference to the gate, realizing that the gate is the public place. It means public life. God said to Abraham, by myself I have sworn, because you've done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, because you have given your son to me. It's referring to the climb up Mount Moriah with Isaac. Because you've not withheld your son from me, indeed I'll greatly bless you, I'll greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed, your descendants, shall possess the gate of their enemies. Your sons, your descendants will go to the enemy cities, and standing in the gates will possess those gates, will take over the land that is currently the property of the enemies. So that has a reference to the covenant promise to Abraham, which finishes, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have heard my voice. God said to Abraham, because of your faith, because you've given your child to me, you shall possess the gate of your enemies, and all the world will be blessed because of what I'm going to do with your children in the world. Now we take that up to our text tonight, and the writer says that children are a blessing to a young person, a young adult who trains them up to be straight and sharp like arrows. They shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. And in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians is a reference of the same sort, talking about the nature of the battle which we ourselves are in. And we can tie this into our verse in Psalm 127 and say, this is what we're supposed to be doing for our children. This is what we're supposed to be preparing our children to do. Paul says, though we walk in the flesh, though we live in the physical, we do not war according to the flesh. Our warfare is not physical. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we're taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. The gates of the enemies is a reference to the kingdom of Satan in the world, a kingdom which Christ has shattered by his resurrection. And now we are in the cleanup phase of the war, where God is wanting us to go as his people into the cities of the enemies and stand in the gates of the enemies and take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, destroying every lofty speculation raised up against the knowledge of God. And if we train our children to follow up our example, and so in the future generation to take a stand for righteousness, then they will be like arrows that we are able to shoot at a distance. As we lie down in death, we'll be able to send them on into the next generation, and they will conquer the enemies that God has sent us to do battle against in their own time. And when the alternative is for them to be defeated by the enemy, then I'm sure you'll agree, however you don't like the military imagery, we need to teach our children to be arrows. We need to teach them to do battle in the days ahead. And so if they're going to serve God, this is the service that God calls them to join us in, taking every thought captive to obedience to Christ, destroying speculations and every lofty idea raised up against the knowledge of God. And so we not only need to teach them to obey us so that they'll learn to obey God, but we need to teach them to speak. I want you to think about the degree to which you're responsible to teach your children to speak. Because they cannot do battle, they cannot be arrows, they cannot speak to their enemies in the gate if they don't know how to speak. They may have a heart to obey God, but if they're not able to actually talk to anybody about the faith, if they're not actually able to represent Jesus Christ to the enemies of Christ, then God will never be able to use them. They will not be useful to God in doing the battle, which is a verbal battle as far as 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 to 5 go. So what's involved in teaching your children to speak? Well, first of all, they need to learn some language, any form of any language. And if your children are past 2 or 3, they're already on to that. They are beginning to master the rudiments of the English language. And I hope you're mystified and mesmerized and absolutely amazed by the ability children have to learn language. It is a miracle. There is no adequate evolutionary theory for language. Language is an absolute evolutionary impossibility. There's no explanation for the origin of language. Linguistic specialists and those who study language as a science are reduced to meaningless babble as they try to explain the origin of language. There's the bow-wow theory and the ding-dong theory and the nonsense theories about how language originated. There is no explanation for language other than the explanation given by the Bible or something similar to the Bible. God taught Adam to speak, that's it. And God put into the descendants of Adam, your children, the ability to learn language when they hear it. And it's an absolutely amazing God-given ability. There's been all kinds of, I'm getting off of tangent, but this is a subject of great interest to me. There's been studies where a child was born to an English-speaking mother and a Spanish-speaking father, and at the age of 4, the child was thoroughly bilingual in English and Spanish. No big deal, except that the father was a sailor and was off to sea a vast majority of the time, and actually only came home every 3 or 4 months, spoke to the child for literally 3 or 4 hours every 6 months of the child's first 3 years. But the child had this God-given ability to pick up a language he learns. So pick up a language he hears. And so he learns to speak the language. And that is a miracle that is going on before your very ears as your child hears you speak. And this is not the point I'm making tonight anyway. This is just sort of beside the point. I mean something much more specific than just teaching them to learn language. But you watch them learn language. It is as good a proof of the existence of God and of the non-animal nature of a human being as anything you will ever see. Remember Ben at 2.5 years old, and I came in on a Saturday morning from elders prayer meeting, and he said at 2.5 years old, "So, how did your prayer meeting go?" And he said, "How did your prayer meeting go?" Something he knew that went is wrong and go is right. And we didn't teach grammar at the age of 2. I mean, I never corrected that kind of thing at that age. He just knew that's not the way the language works. You have to say go they're just absolutely amazed. You watch your children learn that, it's just unbelievable. Anyway, you teach them to speak. And that means, first of all, of course, let them learn the language. Well, all they have to do is hear you speak it, and they will learn your dialect. But then what I'm really talking about is helping them become increasingly able to accurately and powerfully communicate. What you're wanting them to learn to do is actually to master the language so that they can say things that are worth saying. And that takes thousands of hours of practice. To learn the language only takes before they're 5 years old, only takes a few hours of hearing a language. And they'll learn any language they hear spoken consistently, but not even very consistently over the first few years of their life. But to teach them to master a language takes thousands of hours of practice. And I hope you understand that in these days there are not too many people who have come even close to mastering any language. Let me just read to you for your amusement from a book called 12 Baskets of Crumbs by Elizabeth Elliot, a actual tape-recorded conversation that she puts into print for our benefit. She says, "I was one of a panel of experts discussing the subject of marriage in a college woman's dormitory a few weeks ago. Afterward, there were lots of questions, but it was hard to figure out just what the questions were. Here's one of them. Verbatim, I didn't make this up, it was taped and then transcribed." Does this sound like the way people speak these days? This is transcribed, right? Word for word. I have a couple of questions. Do you think do you think a woman could have a call just to be like a wife, but not like not just to be a wife, like say, you know, if you're going to be personal, like my own engagement, like I have a gift of, you know, a talent in music, you know, like, I mean, I know you're not saying like, you know, especially in that case, I mean, you're saying more like you have, like, I think our greatest thing in common probably is that, you know, is the dedication to serve God, you know, and the desire to follow, you know, to do His leading. And like neither of us, you know, and especially in this kind of life, you don't have a blueprint of what He's going to be doing necessarily. You know, I'm just kind of concerned because, like, you know, I've even thought about that because I've kind of had a conflict, you know, growing up in that way. You know, I'm talented musically, you know, so therefore I should probably look for somebody that's talented musically. But he likes it, you know. I mean, he doesn't understand it totally, but I'm sure he could live happily together with it, you know. But I don't expect him to have, you know, yearning to go to all Beethoven concerts or anything, you know. But, I mean, I've heard of very happy marriages where, you know, there's quite different, you know, interests, you know, there. She says, I apologize for not knowing the rules of punctuation for this kind of English. Does that sound like anybody you've heard speak? I always say that sounds like a lot of people you've heard speak, because people do not learn to speak these days, and we need to teach our children to do much better. The fact of the matter is the people who learn to speak are the influential people in society. The people who do well up the corporate ladder are in part the people who know how to speak well. And if we want our children to do well in whatever they put their hands to societally, if we want them to do well in business, if we want them to do well in personal life, we want them to be influential for God, we've got to teach them to master the language, which means teaching them to repeat a story that they've heard, and teaching them to retell a story that they've heard in their own words, and teaching them to describe an event, and teaching them to explain a procedure, and teaching them to defend an opinion, and teaching them to persuade an opponent. These are things that they need to learn how to do. And how are they going to learn to do this? Through thousands and thousands of hours of practice. And if they learn to speak well, then they shall not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. But if they engage an enemy in the gate, if they speak to someone about their faith and don't know how to speak English, they ought to be ashamed. And we ought to be ashamed too, because our responsibility is to prepare them like arrows to do battle. We've got to teach them to speak. Besides that, we've got to teach them to think. Because if they were to learn to speak, but weren't able to think, then the speaking would be all for nothing. And I'd like you to see what it says in Hebrews chapter 5, where the essence of biblical thinking is mentioned. Hebrews chapter 5, in verses 13 and 14, which address the subject of maturity. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, which says, everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food is for the mature, who, because of practice, have their senses trained to discern good and evil. The essence of biblical thinking is the ability to discern good from evil. And what we want to teach our children to be able to think about is the difference between good and evil as they see it in real life. Our children are mature. Our children will become mature as they become able to discern good and evil in a situation. Not only good and evil, but right and wrong. Not only right and wrong, but wise and foolish. Not only wise and foolish, but true and false. All these things are related. We need to teach our children to be able to recognize what is good and right and wise and true about what they see around them. And so also to discern what is evil or wrong or foolish or false about what they see all around them. Now all this you are teaching them to some degree. Just like you're teaching them to speak by letting them hear you speak. As you talk to them about their experiences, as you listen to them and respond to what they tell you, you are teaching them to some degree the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, wise and foolish, true and false. And all the time you're teaching them the differences between these things by responding favorably to some things and saying, oh, that was such a wise thing for that person to say. He says, oh, that's wisdom, that's what wisdom is like, and wisdom's good. And you say, did you see what happened when so-and-so? That was so foolish. And they say, oh, that's what foolishness looks like, and foolishness is bad. While you're teaching them the difference between all of these things, you're also teaching them what is important in life and what is negligible. You're also teaching them what is central and what's tangential. They come home to you with something, and you join in their excitement, and they see, yes, this is important. They come home to you with something else, and you act bored or uninterested, and you teach them, this doesn't matter. There are some things that don't matter. That's the right response in some cases. You should let them know that some things don't matter. And you need to teach them that some things do matter. You are teaching them these things by your responses. At the same time, by your responses and by your conversation, you're teaching them what is solemn and too sacred or important to be laughed at, and what is genuinely funny and ought to be laughed at. You teach them some things are funny but ought not to be laughed at, because although they're funny, they ought not to be funny. And you teach them that some things are solemn and must never be laughed about, and actually you are teaching them that all the time. And what I want you to see tonight is that the persons who teach your children to talk, the people who teach them to think, are the people who are defining the universe for them. And when they leave you, or you leave them, one way or the other in the years to come, they will go on to live in this world according to the definition of the universe that they have accepted. They will live the way they decide to live according to what they understand this world to be. And if they gain the idea that the universe is a party, and the important thing is to have as much pleasure as you can under any conditions whatsoever, if they come to understand that that's what the world is like, if they've defined the universe that way, then they will be hedonistic and self-destructive. If they learn, on the other hand, that the universe is God's sanctuary, that the whole of the world rebounds to the glory of God, with the holiness of God, and there's a war on that must be fought, if that's the definition of the universe they accept, then they will live according to what the Bible says. So the people who teach them to talk and teach them to think, to teach them the difference between wisdom and foolishness and so on, are the people who are defining the universe. And that privilege is your privilege. God gave it to you when He gave those children to you. It's your privilege to define the universe for them. It's your privilege to show them what this world is all about. It's a great privilege. You shouldn't let anybody else take it from you. You should take it yourself. You must teach them what sort of world they live in, so that when you're finished teaching them, they will follow your definition of the universe and live the life that you know God wants them to live. Now let me go from the general philosophical to the very practical right now, and give you, in a very practical terms, something you can do, a couple things you can do for your children which will have a profound effect on your success or failure in biblically defining the universe for them, in giving them a biblical view of the world and of their own lives. On the one hand, I strongly encourage you, this is strictly practical, matter of opinion, this is not in itself biblical, but I think this will aid and abet your efforts to raise them biblically. I urge you to read to them. And along with that, because it has so much to do with your success or failure in reading to them, I would strongly encourage you to sell your television. If not to sell it, at least to think very, very seriously about the role that television plays in their child raising experience. It's not an absolute issue, and this is not biblical advice. The Bible actually has very little to say about television. You can mark this one on the grade, but I want you to think about what would happen and what would be the consequences of where you land on the whole idea of TV or not TV. This is the choice. This is Hamlet's question for parents in the 20th century. There is, on the one hand, the hard line viewpoint, no TV. That you can do that. It's not a legal requirement for every home to have at least one television, or one television on every floor, or one television in every room. You can just get rid of the TV entirely. But that is too hardcore for some people, so you can notch it up a bit and say, well, no commercial TV. We only watch public television. It's hard to monitor because you've got to buy cable to get the public television, and then you got all this stuff coming in. But you could say that, no commercial TV. Or you could say, no unsupervised TV. The children never watch TV alone. It's better than some options. Or you could say no unapproved TV. They're allowed to watch TV alone, but they're only allowed to watch shows that have got the mom and dad stamp of approval. Or you can say not much unapproved TV. Or you can say more or less you shouldn't watch TV, we discourage it. Or you should say, oh, come on, go and watch TV or something. But there's so much at stake here. There's so much to be determined by the degree to which television occupies your child's life. You know the statistics, and I didn't bother bringing them all, but 25 to 30 hours a week is the average amount of TV viewing for children. You know that the children who watch TV are generally 1 pound overweight for every hour of TV they watch in the week. And I mean, there's just all kinds of glaring statistics, which maybe I should have brought. Maybe they're powerful. But I want you to think about what is determined by whether or not your children watch TV while they're growing up in your home. On the one hand, how much TV they have or whether they have TV determines how much time there is to live. Because it's generally understood while the child is watching TV, he is not really doing anything. He's not thinking. The part of the brain that does the thinking shuts down. He's just watching. He's not experiencing anything. He's not doing anything memorable. He's not making memories. He's just actually shut down. The TV's on, he's off. And the degree to which the TV is on is, to a large degree, the degree to which your child is on. It's the degree to which your child's mind is turned on. Just sort of related to this, to illustrate the point, I just flashed into my mind today a memory from maybe 5 or 6 years ago, not directly related to TV, but the point is the same. I was sitting by my parents' pool, when my parents had a pool, drinking Coke or something with my younger brother David. And my parents' house was on a river, and across, it's actually not nearly as glamorous as it's sounding, and across this river, which doubles as a swamp, there's a creek which flows into the river. And my brother David said to me, "See that creek across there? I wonder where that comes from." And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Want to go find out?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You want to paddle the canoe across the river and paddle up that stream? We'll have to probably drag it through a few pastures and stuff. We could take the canoe all the way up to the source of the stream." And I said, feeling sort of sluggish, I don't know. And he said, "Well, it's like this. We'll either not, and this afternoon will be an obliterated non-memory, or we do it, and we'll always remember the day we went across the river and paddled up to the source of the stream." And I said he was right. So we went across, and I could tell you, it wasn't a particularly great adventure, but I remember it. We went through a few pastures and past a few cows, and I remember an overturned tree and a lot of life that afternoon, which I remember, and I would not have remembered it if we hadn't done it. And I just think there's an analogy there because, well, how many afternoons after school watching TV do you remember from your childhood? I spent an awful lot of afternoons watching TV, but I don't remember a thing about them because I wasn't living when I was watching TV. I was just watching other people pretend to live on the screen. But when I turned off the TV and went out and played road hockey or built a tree fort or got into a fight with my neighbor's son, I lived. So we cut down on the actual life experience of our children when we raise the TV, and when we reduce the amount of TV they watch, we increase the amount of living that they do in their lifetimes. Well, then besides that, thinking about learning to speak and learning to think, TV or not TV determines how much time we allow our children to practice speaking and thinking, because we believe, I hope you share with me my conviction, that they'll only learn to speak well and they'll only learn to think through thousands and thousands of hours of practice. And while they're watching TV, they're not talking, except to say to the sister, "Shut up, I'm watching TV." If they turn the TV off, they will speak to one another. And they will have thousands of hours of practice, or hundreds of hours of practice, or dozens of hours of practice, or no practice at all speaking in your house, depending on whether there's TV or not TV. Then besides that, and this is a big one, TV or not TV in your house determines how many other adults in your home will define the universe for them, right? You are working, along with your spouse, I hope, to define the universe and to give them a Christian worldview. But if the TV is on, then all kinds of other people live in your house as well and counteract your definition of the universe with their own definition of the universe. And they got sound effects, and they got special effects, and they got lively music, and they can sing and dance and do a whole lot of other things to powerfully demonstrate their definition of the universe in contrast to yours. And of course, you wouldn't have an open door policy with all of the scummiest people in society, would you? You wouldn't go down to the dirtiest part of town and say to all the people that are groveling around the gutters, "Anytime you want to come into my house, talk to my kids, teach them a thing or two, you're welcome." You wouldn't say that. So then why do you let the TV do the same thing? Because on the TV, all kinds of scummy characters, some of them well-dressed and very, very beautiful, are falsely defining the universe to your children. What kind of definition of the universe they take away from your home depends on who's defining the universe in your home. And that's determined by whether or not it's you and your spouse, or just you, or you and your spouse, and a pile of people that the TV presents to them. I left out two words, for them. And how many other adults in your home will define the universe for them? And then finally, to relate the idea of getting rid of your TV with the idea of reading to them, TV or not TV determines whether or not your children will become readers. And as evidence of this, I would like to read to you from a really neat little book called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, a poem about a boy named Mike TV. The most important thing we've learned as far as children are concerned is never, never, never let them near your television set. Or better still, just don't install the idiotic thing at all. In almost every house we've been, we've watched them gaping at the screen. They loll and slop and lounge about and stare until their eyes pop out. Last week in someone's place we saw a dozen eyeballs on the floor. They sit and stare and stare and sit until they're hypnotized by it, until they're absolutely drunk with all that shocking, ghastly junk. Oh yes, we know it keeps them still. They don't climb out the windowsill. They never fight or kick or punch. They leave you free to cook the lunch and wash the dishes in the sink. But did you ever stop to think, to wonder just exactly what this does to your beloved tot? It rots the senses in the head. It kills imagination dead. It clogs and clutters up the mind. It makes a child so dull and blind he can no longer understand a fantasy of fairyland. His brain becomes as soft as cheese. He cannot think. He only sees. All right, you'll cry. All right, you'll say, but if we take the set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. We'll answer this by asking you, what used the darling ones to do? How used they keep themselves contented before this monster was invented? Have you forgotten? Don't you know? We'll say it very loud and slow. They used to read. They'd read and read. And read and read, and then proceed to read some more. Great Scott, gadzooks, one half their lives was reading books. The nursery shelves held books galore. Books cluttered up the nursery floor. And in the bedroom by the bed, more books were waiting to be read. Such wondrous, fine, fantastic tales of dragons, gypsies, queens, and whales, and treasure isles, and distant shores where smugglers rode with muffled oars, and pirates wearing purple pants, and sailing ships and elephants, and cannibals crouching round the pot, stirring away at something hot. It smells so good. What can it be? Good gracious, it's Penelope. The younger ones had Beatrix Potter with Mr. Todd, the dirty rotter, and Squirrel, Nutkin, Pigling Bland, and Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, and just how the camel got his hump and how the monkey lost his rump, and Mr. Toad, and bless my soul, there's Mr. Rat and Mr. Mole. Oh, books. What books they used to know, these children living long ago. So please, oh please, we beg, we pray, go throw your TV set away. And in its place you can install a lovely bookshelf on the wall. Then fill the shelves with lots of books, ignoring all the dirty looks, the screams and yells, the bites and kicks, and children hitting you with sticks. Fear not, because we promise you that in about a week or two of having nothing else to do, they'll now begin to feel the need of having something good to read. And once they start, oh boy, you watch the slowly growing joy that fills their hearts. They'll grow so keen, they'll wonder what they'd ever seen in that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. And later, each and every kid will love you more for what you did. This is true. It's not that TV can't give them fantasies about dragons and castles and all that stuff. It's that while they're watching it, they're not thinking. They're not learning to think. And they're not speaking to you about what they're thinking. But if you read to them and they discover in books these things, they will develop an imagination, they will develop an ability to think, and they will live.